Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm going to talk about the future of GraphQL tooling. I'm the co-founder at OneGraph, and OneGraph is a data integration platform. We bring all your favorite SaaS APIs into one GraphQL endpoint and give you a nice, easy, consistent interface for querying Salesforce and Stripe and QuickBooks and Crunchbase, and the list goes on. So because we get a lot of customers that are interested in data integration and not really GraphQL as much, we have kind of a very different type of developer that we're going after that maybe isn't as motivated, isn't as sold on GraphQL, and so we've tried to build things to help those people get over the hump. So basically, we're trying to lower the barrier to entry to starting with GraphQL. So I'm sure you're all familiar. This is like the first GraphQL query you might see. It's very simple. And that's what I thought. And then I was in a room pitching a bunch of technical founders on OneGraph. I showed them a beautiful OneGraph query. It was so declarative and easy. It got all of your subscriptions out of Stripe. You didn't have to do any of this imperative code to get the data. And the reaction I got wasn't the one I expected. This isn't simple at all, right? Look at all of these curly brackets. Maybe you could squish them together into one line. It'd be a little simpler. And these were Python programmers that I was talking to, and something like this is a lot more natural to them. That's simple to them, and white space delimited. So of course, I'm not going to suggest that we make GraphQL white space delimited. But we did develop something that helps get these people over the hump, which we call the Graphical Explorer. And I'll do a quick demo of that. So this is Graphical, which hopefully you're all familiar with. And on the left, I have, maybe make this a little bit bigger. I have my Explorer, and we want to get, say, our GitHub repositories. So we click in. It's a very familiar interface. It's just like a file explorer. And as you click, you start learning things about GraphQL. And at every step of the way, you have some success. So hopefully a lot of you have seen this, but I want to highlight a few features that maybe you're not familiar with. So we're going to go into GitHub. We're going to see how fields work. We're going to get the repositories. And here, maybe a little known feature of the Explorer is that you can provide default arguments for a given input type. So in this case, if you are querying GitHub repositories, if you were to send this query without a first argument, you would get back an error. So we've had success every step along the way, and all of a sudden you're back into an error state, and you've got to figure out how to add that first field. So we made it very easy for people to just stay in this beautiful success state where they never encounter any errors. So I'm going to just get a few fields out of this one. Let's get the ID. We'll grab the name. Let's see if I've starred the repos. And we're going to execute that, and then we see it on the right side, right? So we're all happy now. Oops. We've run our query. We can go home. We can be proud of ourselves that we've got some data out of Graphical. But of course, that's the Graphical Explorer. It's open source. You can embed it in your version of Graphical. It's been in, I think, Shopify's version, Gatsby, PostGraphQL, Hasura. The list goes on. And then I just want to show you a little slice of history. This is a version. The initial version of Graphical that Tomocino built, and an early version of React. You can notice it's got check marks. It looks very similar. I think Lee actually wrote the version that's a lot closer to what you see now. But it's kind of interesting. It's got autocomplete with the pluses. It even uses the word Explorer. So it's kind of interesting to see these ideas come back again. OK, but we're here to build things, right? And so we've gotten this query, and we've had some success, but we still have a long way to go. It's a long way between a big hill to climb to get from successfully executing a query and getting that code into your app. And so this is why we built the Graphical Code Exporter. And so we'll do another demo of that here. OK, so I'm going to close the Explorer on this left. I'm going to open up this other plugin, another open source plugin, which is the code exporter. And the code exporter allows you, as the person integrating this into your graphical, to define different snippets. So for example, we can have a curl snippet that just lets you copy this, run it on the command line, and get a result really fast. I'm going to focus a little bit on this JavaScript example that shows you how to build an application with React and Apollo. All right, so it's got all of the requirements you need. You can add these dependencies to your package.json. It shows you how to set up an Apollo client, how to write the query, how to handle the loading state, how to handle errors, even how to log in. And again, we can also kind of teach people who aren't super familiar with GraphQL the best practices by showing them better ways to do things. So for example, if I leave off the name for this query, it encourages me to give this query a name. And we can kind of guide people towards best practices very gently, which is, I mentioned earlier that we see a lot of people that aren't familiar with GraphQL, that aren't as excited about GraphQL as what they can do with OneGraph. And we see a lot of terrible best practices, especially with people using variables. They'll concatenate strings together and make these giant objects when they could provide the variables via JSON and be much happier. OK, so we've got this new feature that we just released yesterday that allows you to create a code sandbox and get actual working code from these examples. So I'm going to pull up kind of a pre-baked example that gets my repos. So there's a few queries. We have the repos query that we did earlier. Just get a few fewer. We have another mutation to star the repo, and the ID on that is hard-coded to the first one in the list. And then another mutation to remove that star. So I'm going to click this Create Code Sandbox button. It's going to go to the Code Sandbox API, generate all the files it needs, and it's going to embed it in this results viewer, which I'm very excited. Orta just talked about the new graphical with extensions. Like getting this into the results pane is a real pain in the butt. I can't wait until that's like first class. OK, so first we see, missing auth for GitHub. And now we get a login button. So I'm going to log in real quick. And you can see it shows me the data. This is just the skeleton of the app. It's not like a real app that you're going to deploy anywhere. But it gets you part of the way, and it shows you how all these things work together. And now you can add in like the React code that you're familiar with. And we can even run these mutations. So you can see this thing is starred here. It's going to use, when I run the unstar mutation, it's going to turn that to false, use some Apollo cache magic. And then we can star it back, because I don't want to unstar my own repo. So that's the code exporter. It's also open source. You can include it in your own version of Graphical. The results pane, you're going to have to do some work on your own to get that kind of fidelity. But it does give you like a little link to go view it. So it's like 90% of the way there. OK. So we also know we've built these like really great tools for developers so that developers can more easily build things with GraphQL. But developers aren't the only ones building things. And these tools, we've built them, they're so easy to use that even non-developers can use them. And the largest programming platform in the world, I think, is Excel. It's got like 650 million developers. And so by talking to people that are outside of the GraphQL ecosystem, we've actually developed something that you can use in Excel. And I'll give you a quick demo of that. So here we have an Excel sheet. It's going to be a little small. Sorry about that. And Excel has these add-ins. And so we built a OneGraph add-in. It allows you to log into your Salesforce account, QuickBooks, Stripe, Trello, et cetera. And you can pull in data. Let's go and pull in some opportunities. So we developed this after talking to a bunch of finance people. And like half of their time is spent doing data entry and pulling in CSVs and reconciling the data from them. So we can pull in For our Salesforce opportunities, these, if you're not familiar, are things that, sales that might happen. So we can pull out the amount. Let's get the name. Let's see who owns this opportunity. We can grab the probability that it closes, and we can get its stage. So now we've got all this data into Excel. It's very easy for us to do it. And now we can use all of our Excel knowledge to start playing around with it and do some analysis. So for example, we could take the probability, divide it by 100, multiply it by the amount, and now we have a nice little projection. And we can go here and we can sum it up. We can filter out anything that was closed. And we can use all of our Excel knowledge to build really cool, quick little apps. OK. So we talked about getting to some success, building some things, getting people over the hump. Now let's talk about some ideas that we have around the next stage, once you have GraphQL already in your organization. So there's this really wonderful thing about GraphQL, and it's self-documenting. So you have fields that have docs, your types have doc strings. The structure of your schema will tell you how things are arranged. Will kind of explain the data model to you. You know, a user has friends, and it's all pretty obvious. So this wonderful thing about GraphQL is, developers don't have to write documentation, right? And hopefully I'm getting some skeptical looks because you do have to write documentation. Please write docs, right? I don't know how to use your API. I don't want to bang my head against it. So, I mean, for a case study to kind of give you some motivation for this, imagine you're an engineer at Facebook, and someone comes to you, a designer comes to you with a mock-up of a Facebook post that's got this beautiful piece of blueberry pie, and they want you to implement the like button. So you go, you open up Graphical, you inspect the mutation type, you search for like, and you don't find anything. What's going on? So I clicked the like button on Facebook.com, inspected the request, and pieced together about what the query that goes to the Facebook server looks like. And you notice it doesn't say like anywhere in here. Instead, the field is feedback react, which isn't something you would expect. And it's because Facebook has this very complicated, beautiful abstraction over comments and likes and loves and other reactions called the Universal Feedback Interface. That's what that UFI stands for. So as the engineer coming to this thing, I don't know how all of this stuff works. I need someone to tell me. I need an example. Okay, but there's a big problem with docs, and that is that docs lie. Right, you can't trust docs. The person who built it, they may have, their example might not work in the first place, right? They're in a rush. Maybe the code has diverged from the documentation. I mean, this is a really common problem. You might have deprecated a field. There's a new way to do it, but no one has updated the docs. And so nobody trusts the docs. So the solution to this is you can enforce the validation. You can use GraphQL's introspection features to your advantage and make sure that when you do make changes to your documentation or into your schema, your documentation gets updated also. So here we have an example of a GitHub doc. Shows you how, this is a markdown file that shows you how to query your GitHub repos. And there's a critical error here. And wouldn't it be nice if when I tried to publish this doc, I got a nice little error that said, OK, this query is invalid. All the line numbers were correct. The line numbers are correct. And it told me, oh, you called this argument furs. You forgot the T. Did you mean first? And this is something that we built. It's still in the kind of a prototype stage, proof of concept. But it's called the Remark plugin GraphQL. And it takes any markdown file with a GraphQL code block in it, and it will run it against your schema and make sure that the query is valid. And you can do a lot of other cool stuff like this. If you go to the GraphQL.org pages, and you look at the examples there, all of those examples are dynamic. You can type in them. They have a mini graphical that I think Lee built. And we can embed that into it directly. So another problem is the docs, they live somewhere else in another system. And they're not where we want them, right? Because we're in Graphical. This is where we're trying to solve our problems. And the docs, they live in an internal wiki or on /docs or something like that. So the solution here, I think, is to bring those docs into context, right? So here I'm looking at the repositories field in Graphical. We spent all that effort writing these examples, so we ought to get some benefit from them. So we can look at them, we can analyze them, and find the type info for each field, and we can see, oh, this viewer's repost query that we have in our examples uses the repositories field, and we can show it in context. And so when we need the examples, they're there waiting for us. So this is something that we're thinking about with examples. We think there's a lot of interesting things to explore about making it easier to create examples, easier to document your examples, build pages for your examples so that you can benefit from them. People can search them. You can even benefit from the SEO. So this is a big thing where there's a lot of ideas. I think if you look at Postman, they do some really interesting things with their collections, and we should copy some ideas and take some inspiration from there. OK, so the last thing I want to talk about is persisted queries. So this is a topic that I think not many people are doing well. And there's just so much potential here. It's pretty far in the future, I think, of anything happening, but it's just very exciting because of everything that you can do with these and the potential that they unlock. So let's talk about what are persisted queries. So let's go back to that query from earlier, that like query. So when I clicked that like button, this big giant query didn't get uploaded to Facebook's server. They didn't send that query string. Instead, they sent this tiny ID. And so when someone was developing, when they wrote that query on their computer, there was a compile step that uploaded this query to the server, got an ID back, stored the query in the database. And then later, when I go and I send the query back to the server, I just send this ID. It looks up the query in the database. And then it executes the query and sends me back the result. So there's a lot of benefits to this. One is you send and receive less data. So when you send the JavaScript that's going to execute these queries, you don't have to send the full query string. You just send this little ID. But more importantly, when you send the query back to the server, you're not sending this giant string, you're sending a tiny ID. And it's more important on the upload side, because on the upload side, you don't have gzip. Like browsers don't do a good job of gzipping requests. They do a good job of handling gzipped responses. This also can help you prevent DOS attacks, because you're not letting people write arbitrary queries. They can't add arbitrary levels of nesting. And they can't bypass your protections. So with a persisted query, if you accidentally put in a very expensive query, you can always block that one query. You can't just rearrange the fields to bypass a filter. And if it's possible, you can even modify that query in place. So imagine you had accidentally asked for 1 million nodes instead of 100. Right? You can just make that change in the query itself. It also makes it much easier to cache your queries. So every time a query comes into your GraphQL server, there is a step where it has to parse the query. And that takes a little bit of CPU and a little bit of execution time. So since when you use persistent queries, you have this list of all of the queries that your server is going to accept. You can find the most used ones, pull them out of the database, parse them, and store them in a map. And it's also great for caching results. It gives you a really nice cache key if you have public data that your server is sending. And then lastly, and this is the part where I get excited, and where we've done some interesting things with OneGraph, is it's a very convenient place for metadata. And in our case, we'll do a demo, we allow you to embed auth with your queries. And so this allows your persisted queries to kind of become like small serverless functions. So there's this phenomenon that I'm fascinated by of the open startup. And this is a group of startup founders, usually with like smaller companies, that publish all of their results. So they tell you exactly how much money they make each month, and they put little graphs, and it's just so fascinating. And I was thinking about how would I implement that, or how would we implement that? And it would probably be something, if I wanted to show people, for all of my Stripe subscriptions, what's the total, how many subscriptions do I have, how many customers do I have, I would get a Stripe key, I would maybe create a Lambda function, or a function in my server. It would fetch all of my subscriptions from Stripe, add them up, and send back the number. So with that in mind, we're going to build a persisted query that does pretty much the same thing. So we're here in the OneGraph dashboard. We're going to call this query Stripe subscriptions. Oops. We're going to go into Stripe. We're going to get all of my subscriptions. For each subscription, we're going to get the plan. Oh, all the nodes. We're going to get the plan. And the plan has an amount, an interval, and an interval count. And a subscription consists of multiple plans. So there is a quantity field. And if we multiply the quantity times the amount on the plan, we get the monthly subscription. And then I can go and assign an auth token. So I created this beforehand. This is an auth token for the Stripe account of my previous startup. It was a collaborative prototyping app. We've turned off billing, but the app still lives on. So we're going to see the data from that. And then I mentioned caching earlier. We don't want to hammer the Stripe server, so we're going to give this like a 600-second cache. And OneGraph will get the result, store it in the cache, and the next time I make this query, it's going to fetch it from the cache if it's been less than 5 minutes. So we're going to create this, and we have successfully created it. It has a little curl string here that we can run to check it out. Let's see if I have my, so I execute that. That's not very pretty. Let's put it through JQ. And then I can see all my subscriptions. But I've only let you get like certain fields. I don't want to tell you who my customers are because those people have privacy concerns. I just want to tell you how much they're paying me. And so this allows me to do that. And then I can go over here into the code sandbox, and I can write a little bit of code to spin this up. And now anybody who wants to can go to this page, kcmk9.csv.app. And they can see exactly how my startup is doing. So that's what I've got for the talk. So a couple of takeaways are, build things for people who aren't in the GraphQL ecosystem, who don't think like you and I do, who are coming from different backgrounds, and lots of wonderful things will come out of this and help GraphQL to flourish. Thanks.